Hello, motion viewers. Today, Mr. Tom Hafer is going to talk about the mystery of the missing pilot. The incident happened way back to early 50s. Good morning, Mr. Hafer.
Morning, Dr. Liu. How are you? The mystery of the missing pilot, hero or racial victim, the story of Andrew Alexander McCoy, Jr. That's a picture of an F-84 for certain reasons. Back in June of 2020, we had family discussions about racial incidents, and my mother told a story about a black West Point graduate who was a friend of my father's and a classmate in the West Point graduating class of June 1946. After graduation, when he was traveling through the South, he was pulled over because he was driving a new car, and the police assumed that the car was stolen and did not believe that he was an Army officer. It's true that in 1946, black Army officers were very rare because the military in this country was not integrated until 1948. And getting him out of jail required a telephone call to the superintendent of West Point to verify that yes, he really was an Army officer, and yes, it really was his car. He joined the Air Force when it was formed in 1948 and became a fighter pilot. And later on, while piloting his aircraft, he died in a crash. Now, my father had speculated that this could have been a crash on takeoff from sabotage that was due to his race. Unfortunately, back at that time, shortly after integration, racial incidents were not uncommon both in society and in the military, so it was not out of the question. So, challenge was, can we find out information about this 70 years later? It seemed like a long shot to me. But the first thing we did was we looked at the online version of the West Point yearbook. It's called the Howitzer. This was for the class of June 1946. And page after page of white faces showed up. And we could not find anybody who looked black. But fortunately, I got in touch with the West Point historian, and she was able to point out that this man right here, Andrew Alexander McCoy, was indeed a black graduate, and you can find him on page 294 of the 46 Howitzer. Now that we'd found his name, I was able to find out a bit more about him on the internet. He was born in 1922 in a rural part of Pennsylvania, but moved to Pittsburgh as a boy and spent most of his life there. He attended Westinghouse High School in Pittsburgh, which was a very good school at the time. And furthermore, he graduated from the University of Pittsburgh in 1943, pre-law. So this was a man with great ambitions. It was very unusual for black men to graduate from college and to be pre-law students at that time. Because everybody was going to go into the service, every young male was going to go into the service back in those times. This was in the middle of World War II. He entered West Point in June of 1943 and graduated as a second lieutenant in June of 1946, the same class that my father was in. And he did die in a crash of his F-84G fighter on 30 December 1952 in Italy. And on the right here, I've got some clippings from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that show that he and his family were in the news regarding graduation from junior high school, his appointment to West Point, and so on. So the question became, now that we've identified the man, what are the details of the crash? Could it have been sabotage? Oh, we were able to find two memorial articles about him. One on the West Point Memorial website and the other in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And from that, we were able to find that in the West Point Memorial website, it said that his crash occurred on December 31st, 1952, near Forlì, Italy. So the question is, can we get personnel and crash records to determine what the cause of the crash was? If it was a crash on takeoff, then my father's suspicion might be validated. If it's something else, then we'll have to see. So over a year ago, on the 27th of April, 2021, I made a formal request for his combat records. And because it's more than 62 years old, these records should be open to the public. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I got nothing. And I enlisted the help of my senator, and his aides got involved and said, hey, make this a priority. Still got nothing. So my suspicions are beginning to build. Worse yet, I poke around on the internet trying to find out for myself, and I come on an image of his gravesite. Here it is, Andrew A. McCoy, Pennsylvania, World War II. But associated with that gravesite was this discussion. And this says, no, he didn't die on the 31st of December, 1952 in Italy. He died on the 30th of December, 1952 in South Korea. I'm going, yikes. Is misinformation being passed out? And why aren't I getting any records from the Pentagon? So my suspicions began to build. Could this be some kind of a cover-up? What's going on? Well, in preparation for this discussion, I kept looking, and I finally found this. This is a crash record from 30 December 1952, and it shows that indeed an F-84 Thunderjet operated by Andrew Alexander McCoy crashed. The reason that it was hard to find is because the date was off from, it wasn't the 31st of December, it was the 30th. And it didn't mention Forlì, Italy. Instead, it mentioned that it was near a larger town. So it says that it was en route between Germany and Greece. So I looked to see what that would look like. And if he took off from Germany, someplace up here near Ramstein Air Force Base, and was headed for Greece, he would indeed have traveled directly over the crash site, which is shown by this pin. And he would have traveled hundreds of miles before going there. So it clearly was not a crash on takeoff. So my conclusions are that the downing of the aircraft was not a crash on takeoff, but rather a crash in the mountains after several hundred miles of flight. And back then, before we had GPS and good weather forecasting and all the modern aviation instrumentation, it was not uncommon, especially if there was a storm, especially if there was low visibility, for aircraft to encounter problems in mountains where there's a lot of turbulent air, especially if there's a storm. So I still don't have the details of the crash. I would like to find out what the cause of the crash was attributed to. But it's most likely not due to sabotage of the aircraft. So in summary, Captain Andrew Alexander McCoy was a man who was greatly ahead of his time. He was a role model for all, a friend to my father, and a leader who died in service to his country. He should be remembered. So, Memorial Day is coming. That's the time for remembrance of people who've given their lives in service to their country. And I would ask that people take a moment and remember Captain McCoy, a man ahead of his time.